Hello, and welcome to another exciting episode of Stan the History Man. I'm your host, Dr. Stanley Sandler. Today I'd like to talk about the Whig Party of the United States. Now, some historians say, the Whigs. I mean, that's a weird name, and what do they stand for anyway? Well, actually, they were a serious political party. The origins of the name are somewhat obscure. I think there were uh, two rival factions in the border between England and Ireland that would fought each other almost like bandits. And one was called Whig, and the Whigs, and the other was Tories. And in England, for some reason, the party that was wanted to control the king's power called themselves Whigs. I mean, they weren't against the monarchy, but Magna Carta and all that, the king shouldn't have that much power. So, and the conservative party believed that, the king should be the monarch and so on, but called the Tories. Well, that idea or that nomenclature came over to the United States in reaction to Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was probably next to Lincoln, the most popular president of the 19th century. And he was very, he knew what he wanted and he got it. And they began to call him King Andrew. And so those who were against Andrew Jackson began to call themselves Whigs. So the Whigs, and it developed into a party about the 1830s. I mean, nothing set up, no laws or anything, but just sort of coalesced that way and eventually became a political party. Now, what did the Whigs stand for? Well, numerous things at the time. A party of business and commerce. And so they were all for railroads, and they pushed through bills, for example, which gave railroads on public land. Every other section of the land would go to the railroads. The idea being, well, if there's no railroad, there's not going to be much business. So we give them the land, and then they develop the land, and we get that money back in taxes and so on. And the railroads get a lot of money too. So the railroads, in many historians say the railroads really developed this country, and the Whigs have got to get a lot of credit for it. You see, the Jacksonians, the Democrats, as they were then called, just to confuse you, originally they're called the Democratic Republicans, but they're called Democrats. They followed the Jeffersonian dream of small farmers. It's sort of like a New Zealand baby that every man is his own king in his own little farm. They were for the little guy, the little white guy. We have to point that out, because they were the party of slavery, and not just in the South. I mean, they believed in slavery, and so the two parties began to coalesce and be the two main political parties. The Federalists had died out by this time, so they were the party of commerce, also not just railroads, but steamships. And one of the things they believed in was that we're a new developing country, and we should not just be relied upon to supply wheat and cotton and corn and so on, timber to the European countries. In exchange, they send us the manufactured goods, because it always seemed to be that the manufactured goods got more money than the agricultural goods. And so they wanted to impose tariffs, and that, which of course would raise the price of domestic manufactured goods. But the tariffs, the big split between the Whigs and the Democrats over the tariff. And you can see how the tariff can make a real difference. If up until 1843, railroad iron could come into this country, primarily from England, I'm sure, tariff-free, tax-free. And but 1843, under the Whigs, a tariff bill was slapped on rails, because in that year the first American railroad rails were being drawn out in an American factory. So you see there, it's and on the other hand, the Democrats said we don't tariffs just raise the price for everything. One of the major causes of the Civil War, was not just states' rights and slavery, but the tariff. A constant battle between the two parties on that. But the Whigs stood for more than just economics. They were kind of reflection of that era, in a sense, even more than the Democrats. For example, they went right along with the evangelical revival. They felt that there were actually moral and emotional reasons for it, but also that our working men, that the people in our factories and so on, we want them to lead clean, moral lives. That makes them better workers. And a very tangible way that the Whigs expressed this was they were very strong supporters of the temperance movement. Now, you might say, oh, yeah, Prohibition, 1920s, it didn't work. But in the 19th century, it was a hot political item. As a matter of fact, as early as 1850, Maine passed a prohibition law. Now, how much it was enforced, I don't know. But again, the idea among the Whigs was, the factory owners and so on, the railroad owners, was, well, you can't have drunken workers around all this expensive machinery. They're going to hurt themselves. They're going to hurt us. So they were, you wonder, well, how can prohibition get so much? I mean, how many Americans really believe in prohibition? But the bankroll, the subsidizing came very heavily from the Whigs. And there was also a very strong women's movement, also, of course, because they don't like to see their husbands spending the rent money in the local bar. So it was a combination of local or of moral reasons and also of economic reasons. We don't want a bunch of drunken workers around. And you can say, well, yeah, that's pretty obvious. But, it wasn't that obvious in the 18th century. We were heavy. We drank twice as much in the 18th century and probably up until the 1840s as we do today, about twice as much of spirits. I'm not including beer and wine. I mean, just spirits, whiskey, rum, that sort of thing. President John Adams, every morning for breakfast, he'd have a tankard of hard cider. And nobody said, oh, he's a drunkard. No, it was that's the way people, a lot of people felt that alcohol was a medicine. It was good for you. So the Whigs were in on that too, get rid of alcohol. A lot of other things too, child labor. Then they just got hooked up with the great reform movements of the 19th century. And I'm not saying that Democrats said, "Oh, drink a lot," and no, but I mean their main concern was the small farmers in this country, not to mention the big farmers, the plantation owners of the South and in the South. So. In the question of slavery, which certainly was rolling the country at the time and got worse, was probably what spelled the end of the Whig Party, because the Whigs sort of felt, look, we get this country developed and modern. Slavery is such an anachronism; it'll basically die out. And it didn't. They thought it because not only, and a lot of people don't realize this, not only did the South, the Democrats, we got to remember this. I'm not being political here. The South. And you can see this during when the Confederacy was a one-party state, Democrats. All right, there were some cotton Whigs in the South, but they sort of died out by about the time the Civil War began. So the thing, what I want to mention about, or go into some detail about the South, was not only they felt that, well, the Whigs are going to stop us from expanding, and the expanding cotton states. That is the reason why we should mention, of course, Abraham Lincoln was a Whig. He in his one term, 1846, 1848, as a congressman, he was a strong Whig, and he was opposed not necessarily to slavery as such, although he detested the institution, but the expansion of slavery. And the South, they were talking about, well, of course, you could argue that the Mexican War was not just a manifest destiny and go from sea to sea, which that was part of it, but also to spread new cotton territories, because the Whigs are there. They're going to stop us from spreading it. I mean, they thought about Mexico. Well, we can get a lot of slave cotton territory. They had they tried under Secretary of State Buchanan, Democrat, wanted to buy Cuba. All right, and what wonderful slaves they were there. It's hot, it's wet, and that should be a good climate for growing cotton. As a matter of fact, they tried to bump off Nicaragua, and I think one other southern state as well. And they didn't send the army in or the National Guard from Mississippi, but they sent in what they call filibuster expeditions that would go in, and then they could be denied later on. We don't know who these guys are, but they tried to overtake the government of a number of these countries to make them slave states. I mean, this is that the South was really mad keen on this, because of course cotton was king, they said, and in many ways they're right. Our biggest export by 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, was cotton, and so but they wanted to expand it, make more money. And that this is where the Whig Party finally fell apart. They also had on the question of the expansion of slavery. They also had rotten luck with their presidential. Uh, Both of the guys who were elected as president died in office. First, William Henry Harrison, who died after only a little over a month in office. He gave the longest American inaugural speech, and it was stated that was only only had a little over a month, I think, in office. And then also General Taylor, he 2 years in office, and then he died as well. And both of these presidents were in favor of not expand, were against expansion of slavery, even though Taylor was actually a slave owner himself. But and then Millard Fillmore, he's kind of a joke now. Fillmore succeeded Taylor and was even less effective in fighting this spread of slavery. And so that is why that counts for the rise of the Republican Party. You can see the transition from Lincoln as a Whig to Lincoln as a Republican. I should mention also the great leader of the Whig Party was Henry Clay. Clay was called a great compromiser. He stitched together compromises in 1832 and 1850, Great Compromise of 1850. And again, his attitude towards slavery was, I'm not really that keen on it. He was from Kentucky, but let's not tear the country apart over this. Matter of fact, Clay had a slave, a personal, I call him my man. And on these political rallies and all, people might say, what do you think about slavery? And aren't you against slavery? And he'd say, see my man Bob over here. He can leave anytime he wants. Bob, do you want to leave me now? And Bob would say, no, sir. And it was kind of like that's the way the Whigs dealt with the slavery question. Well, it just couldn't go on like that forever. And even though I say Lincoln said that Clay was his great ideal of a politician, but Clay died in 1852, the early 1850s, and that left a big hole in the because Clay had nationwide support, except in the South. It was there, but there were Cotton Whigs, but not that much. I say again, the Whigs were the party of business and commerce and trading, and the Democrats were the party of the small white farmer, except when it came to cotton. And by this time, most of the Cotton Whigs had died out or just went along with the Democrats. And so the big question over that made Lincoln go over to the Republicans was the expansion of slavery. And I told you some of the ideals, almost like crazy ideals that the Southerners had for expanding slavery. It's not just like, well, just keep it where it is, which is what Lincoln said. I have nothing. He tried to explain, I have nothing against the institution of slavery where it is. And, we're just going to leave it at that. And the Democrats the South was so fixated that they said, he's an abolitionist. He said, I am not an abolitionist. I'm a Republican when we're only against the expansion of slavery. And, the hatred of the Republicans was so great in the Deep South that the Republican candidate, Lincoln, did not get a single popular vote. I'm not talking about electoral votes. Not a single vote from the Deep South, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, all of them. They of course swept the board with the electoral vote, but not even a single. I mean, they're just. It's like you think they're really thinking. Maybe I'm looking retrospectively at it all, but it's like they weren't even thinking. And the other thing was that they really shot themselves in the foot, the Democrats, because the secessionists. Now they're all Democrats. There were a number of Democrats who want to keep. They call them Union Democrats. Want to keep the Union. Yeah, they didn't care about slavery, but keep the Union together. McClellan, Lincoln's opposition in the 1864 election, was certainly a Union. In fact, he ran on the Union Party. Even though McClellan, he didn't care about slavery one way or the other, but they shot themselves for everything the South wanted and were fighting the Whigs for, such as cut down the tariffs, do not interfere with slavery, and cotton is everything. Well, by the end of the war, the Republicans passed everything that they wanted, which is what the Whigs had wanted originally, such as a tariff, transcontinental railroad, which the South said, if it's not going to go through the South, we don't want one, and cotton. A lot of people don't realize that cotton. Especially the English were so fed up with the broils of the United States, the Civil War, and everything. So forget it, and they expanded their cotton growth in India and Egypt, which is good climate territory for cotton. So cotton certainly wasn't wiped out. Now we still grow lots of cotton here, but no longer is it king. They had to compete with the British Empire in India and Egypt. So the cotton ceased to be king. It just became a. Oh, I should mention one last thing about cotton itself too, which a lot of historians don't. They say, well, about the most they'll say is cotton is cheap, but it's more than that. Cotton, you could wash it. You can't wash, linen or leather or wool, which is what people wore before the time of cotton, silk. But with cotton, especially underwear, you just take it off and throw it in a bucket and wash it, preferably warm water. But if not, so you can imagine some poor worker in a textile mill in Manchester, he now could, change his underwear every 1 or 2 days, or a peasant in India. In that climate, it's easy, just to, wash. It's so washable and cheap. And that was one of the big reasons for the insatiable demand for cotton in the 1840s and 50s after the invention of the cotton gin. I don't think historians can talk about that too much, as what a wonderful substitute replacement for the rather awkward clothing of the time before the cotton gin. So that's a story that I say that the Whigs did not survive the Civil War. Even just before the war, it had gone into oblivion. But I think it's a party that was worth looking at. And a lot of the things that they called for, we could certainly use some today. So I can say, seriously, bring back the Whigs. Well, this is another episode of Stan the History Man. I'm your host, Dr. Sandler, and thank you very much for listening. Bye-bye.